Welcome back to Every Other Carl. I'm Carl, and today I'm back working on the shed. So all the framing is completed, and in this video I'm going to show you the process of installing the wall sheathing. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos on this project, I'm building a 10 by 16 foot barn style shed with a loft. This is going to be used as a studio space, so it's built stronger than a typical tool shed. In this video, I'll show you the full process of sheathing the walls and roof. Let's start with the walls. My walls are a bit non-standard in height because my 2x4 studs were a mix of free and cull wood and are cut a bit short at 86.5 inches. With a bottom plate and a double top plate, the total height from the floor to the top of the top plate is 91 inches. This measurement doesn't matter so much for the sake of this video. You can translate in your own measurements, but I wanted to give some context for why I'm cutting my sheathing the way I am. I have a double top plate. I'm leaving the upper top plate exposed and installing my wall sheathing vertically from the lower top plate down to about 1.5 inches below my floor decking. I'm leaving the bottom of my sheathing fairly high up on the floor joists to keep it as far away from the ground as possible to avoid rainwater from splashing up and soaking into the bottom of the OSB. But by having the sheathing come down and nail into the floor joists, this ties all the elements of my structure together. The floor joists, bottom plate, wall studs, and top plate. This is what will make my structure rigid. The reason I'm leaving the upper top plate exposed is so that I can integrate the top plate into my roof trusses when I install that sheathing. I'm using 7/16 OSB for my wall sheathing. My roof sheathing will be thicker at 19/32, but more on that later. I started by cutting the OSB to my desired height, which for me meant removing 3 inches lengthwise. Then cut the panels to width so that vertical joints would meet at a stud. I'm using 3¼ inch galvanized framing nails to hold my sheathing. This length is overkill. Typically 2 to 2¼ inch nails are advised, but I had a bunch of these 3¼ inch nails left over from framing. I also set the pressure on my air compressor a little lower so that the nails wouldn't blow through any of the panels. A note on safety: if you're working with a partner, make sure they're never directly on the other side of the panel when you're nailing. You could easily miss a stud and send a nail straight through the sheathing. Before continuing to all the wall panels, my wife and I put up some wire mesh at the end of the floor joists to keep our overly curious neighborhood groundhog out. With my wife helping me, I could simply lift a panel into position and then mark all the cuts for windows and rafter overhangs. The nailing pattern I'm using is just about every 4 inches around the perimeter of the panels and about every 6 inches in the field of the panels. Remember, the wall sheathing is primarily what's going to give your structure its rigidity, so don't be stingy on the nails. If you're working by yourself or you're trying to get the job done faster, you can simply install the panels and then cut the windows out later. Or you mark the panel and cut it before installing. When nailing panels into position, I would start with one nail, or sometimes a screw since it's easier to remove, at the bottom corner of the panel closest to the already mounted adjacent panel. Then ensure that the two panels have just about a 1/8 inch gap between them. This is important to allow the OSB to expand and contract without buckling. Then nail up the side along the adjacent panel and then install the nails outward. This method allows you to make minor adjustments to the panel without having to remove it completely. The next part of the process was to prep to sheath the second floor. In order to do this, we needed to install 4 studs under the end trusses on either end of the building. Before installing the sheathing, I decided to permanently fasten the floor of the loft down. I ran beads of construction adhesive along the top of each floor joist, then screwed and nailed down the floor panels. The nails provide strength, and the screws and adhesive keep the floor panels from ever coming up or squeaking. I finished putting all the wall sheathing up on the first level, and now I'm working on getting the sheathing on the end of the gambrels. This sheathing ties the top plate of the walls into the roof trusses. The angles were a bit hard to measure perfectly, but I oversized the panels slightly and then cut off any excess. Alright, it's been a little while. We had some delays due to rain. We had some pretty powerful thunderstorms and temporarily put up this plastic roof and windows just to try to protect the OSB. But today's goal is to get at least this row here, this front row, of roof sheathing on. So that's what we're going to work on. A lot of the OSB got wet from the thunderstorms, It's just kind of stained. And I've been spraying a bunch of it just as we go with some mold control stuff, just to try to get ahead of the game, make sure we don't get any mold in here. You can see a lot of things got wet, but I've been having fans running, trying to keep this place nice and dry and let it air out. But today, first part of the roof is going on. There's a misconception that OSB gets destroyed if it gets wet. That's not true. It will swell, especially around the edges, but if you let it dry out, it'll usually be okay, even if it's still a little thicker than it originally was. It does take longer to dry out than plywood, but it also tends to warp less than plywood. It's definitely still a good idea to protect your work from the rain as much as possible. This plastic did a great job. After pulling back the plastic, I got some measurements and cut my first piece of roof sheathing. Like I said in the beginning, I'm using 19/32 inch OSB for the roof. My trusses are spaced at 24 inches on center. If your trusses are spaced at 16 inches on center, you could get away with using the same 7/16 wall sheathing on your roof, but it's a better idea to go stronger, and I definitely wouldn't go any less than 19/32 with 24 inch trusses. This first row of roof sheathing was the hardest to install, and it definitely helped to have a second pair of hands. A couple things to point out: I have an overhang on the ends of the building. It's about 8 to 10 inches. That's something to factor in when measuring. Also, this lower pitch of the roof is over 4 feet tall, so I have one 4-foot piece of sheathing and then roughly a 5-inch strip above it. I made sure to stagger the joints of these pieces so that all the trusses were well connected and integrated. This steep pitch sheathing is what gives the barn-style roof its rigidity. You want to make sure there's no weak spots. With this first row of roof sheathing in place, my trusses were locked into their final positions, so I added truss ties on the inside. Alright, I'm adding these truss ties for the gambrel trusses I have here. You can call them hurricane ties or something. Anyway, they're brackets. One side goes right onto the top plate of the wall, and the other side goes into the side of the truss. Just holds it down, because until now all I have are these toe-nailed nails going into the top plate, and yeah, this adds a whole lot of strength. So I'm going to put those on each one of the trusses going all the way down. After the truss ties, I installed my last pieces of wall sheathing and then started the sheathing on the upper pitch of the roof. If you notice, I screwed this 2x4 all the way across the bottom pitch of the roof as a step for me to use when installing the top pitch of the roof. This was very helpful and strong since I screwed it directly into the trusses. I staggered the top pitch sheathing with the bottom pitch so that the joints didn't meet at the same rafters. With the top pitch on, the sheathing was done. Alright, the framing and sheathing is almost entirely done, which is very exciting because this is essentially where I would have started if I had bought a pre-made shed kit. The last thing I have to do before I start roofing is build these 2x4 end gables that go around the overhang on the long ends of the building. These end trusses were very simple. I used pressure-treated 2x4s since these would be exposed to the elements, and cut 22.5-degree angles on each end, similar to my structural trusses. I then screwed through the roof overhang to attach them. Then I added 8-inch 2x4 blocks to connect the truss to the walls. With that, all the sheathing is done. This little white trim is a teaser for next video where I'll be starting the roofing process. I'll start by adding venting and then roofing, but you'll need to stay tuned for that. Alright, that's going to do it for sheathing. In the next video, I'm going to start venting the roof and then start the roofing process. So if you would, please subscribe if you want to see the rest of this build. If you like the video, like the video. If you have any questions or comments, maybe you saw something that you could have done better, leave it in the comment section below. It'll help somebody else out. Until next time, I'm Every Other Carl, and I'll see ya.